Welcome to Stream of Conscience, brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, where we believe that change is possible and you can make it happen. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is State Representative Jonathan Steinberg of Westport's 136th District. Jonathan is in his second term and sits on 4 committees in Hartford: Energy and Technology, where he is Vice Chair, Finance, Transportation, and Aging. He's also on several task forces, including shoreline preservation and one dealing with issues of genetically modified organisms. Prior to going to Hartford, Jonathan was a member of Westport's RTM and has been very active on a number of town initiatives. Jonathan, welcome back to Stream of Conscience.
It's nice to be back.
Jonathan, I know that you're vice chair of one of the committees in energy and technology. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so what are you guys doing in this session of the legislature?
Well, we thought last session was pretty active with the passage of the landmark energy legislation that led to the creation of DEEP, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. As it turns out, this session has been equally active, mainly because now that DEEP has an energy policy capability, which it didn't have previously, there's been a very aggressive new agenda coming out of DEEP. The landmark aspect of this year's session is the comprehensive energy strategy. It was debuted last fall and now has completed its public comment, and there is a resulting bill which includes really a lot of innovation which will benefit Connecticut. We will continue to focus on conservation. There's a lot of focus on renewable energy, and of course the most controversial element is the big bet on natural gas infrastructure, that we want to add hundreds of thousands of new homes and businesses to natural gas to give them choice, given that natural gas prices are relatively low right now, and there's an expectation there'll be sufficient supply and low prices going forward. So the natural gas exploitation in this country has been focused on the policy of fracking, not the policy, actually, the technology of fracking. And we've done several shows on that. We think we on this show have some problems with that approach. Is that what we're going to depend on for gas in the future? It's ironic that it's DEEP as the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, because the two of them are a little bit in conflict on this one. I have similar concerns to what you expressed. In fact, I introduced a bill this session banning the use of any fracking waste or storage thereof in the state of Connecticut. As you may be aware, the kind of shale that's in Connecticut is really not attractive for real hydraulic fracturing extraction. However, there are a number of processing plants in the state which might be interested in actually trying to process the wastewater, of which there are millions of gallons for each fracking wellhead, such that it may actually be returned to some sort of usable condition. Unfortunately, wastewater treatment plants that have tried to process in the past have not done so well. If you think about some of the things that are in that special mix that's injected into the ground and then comes back out again, you've got heavy metals, dissolved gases, and in the case of the Marcellus Shale, fairly radioactive material. It's not classified as radioactive because the petroleum industry earned an exemption by the federal government so that the materials related to extraction are not deemed hazardous materials as per radioactive materials, but conceivably it can be every bit as dangerous. So my bill has made it through the Energy and Technology Committee. However, as is often the case, it has been diminished to some degree. It is now a 1-year moratorium to allow DEEP to do an in-depth study of the ramifications of trying to handle fracking waste. I'm a little disappointed, but it's an important statement, and I really hope we get it to the floor and it passes.
And the comprehensive energy policy you were speaking of before, what are the prospects for that?
Oh, it's certainly going to pass. There are many people who are very concerned about the bet on natural gas for a couple of reasons. One is that it may be a cleaner fossil fuel, but it's still a fossil fuel. And the methane that is generated is a major hothouse gas problem for us. In some ways, more problematic than carbon dioxide would be. Secondly, there's the concern that this may be a bridge to finally getting to using more renewable energy. But how long a bridge is it really? They're talking about 75, 100 years. Many of us feel that that is based upon maybe some faulty assumptions. It assumes rather modest demand increases, yet we're talking about using it not only to generate heat, but to generate electricity. It's sort of the clearinghouse energy source we use in the state of Connecticut. We use a lot of it for our electrical generation.
This is natural gas.
Natural gas. It could be involved with powering major fleets in many municipalities or in large commercial capability. And if you really expand it to such broad scale commercial and residential use, we're talking about a huge increase in demand. In fact, to the point that our current major main lines for natural gas in the state don't have a wide enough bore to get us the gas we're going to need. In fact, ISO New England, which is responsible for energy capacity in the New England area, issued a warning saying that they were unsure whether we would have sufficient natural gas, particularly in the summer months, for all of our needs.
So beyond natural gas in this comprehensive energy policy, what else is envisioned? How much are we looking at renewables?
Well, there are those who would argue, even though it's one of the central planks of the comprehensive energy strategy, that there's not as much real in-depth attention to it. And in fact, it has related to another bill that just passed the Energy and Technology Committee this past week, which was also controversial, which enables the DEEP to, in combination with other states, most likely Massachusetts and Vermont, to go out and buy renewable energy contracts. Currently, our Class 1 under the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, is more of a market-driven purchasing. This would create a new class in this bill for contracted Class 1 renewable energy. And the big bet with regard to going out and buying these contracts is something known as Quebec hydropower. Now, this is existing hydropower. One argues how clean it really is because they had to flood a lot of land in Canada to get it. And it comes over long transmission lines, which really, they're looking for a new path, but there's huge investment, and then there are environmental concerns about where this new transmission line will go. But the theory is this is cheap, plentiful, continuous energy, semi-renewable in that sense. And again, DEEP is making a big strategic commitment, a real policy gamble that this will be a good way for us to meet our renewable portfolio standards going forward. In fact, one of the aspects of the bill, which is very controversial, is they're changing the actual standards. They're changing the goals and the percentages to include a large percent of this, these hydro purchases to meet our goals. And frankly, the environmental community is very concerned about this because we were unable to vet the RPS report that was due out in February because it came out in March, the day after the bill was introduced. We had, many of us, less than 24 hours to read the report that justified the bill. And many people are very concerned about that. I was one of 8 people on the committee. It was a 16-8 vote who voted against the bill because the RPS report had not been properly vetted. And I think we needed to respect the process, given how much is at stake with our long-term commitment to renewable energy.
Where does that bill go next?
Because it has a clause in it which enables the Commissioner of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to go out and purchase these contracts as of March 31st, rumor has it has to come out when we're in session this Wednesday, or else it would expire and not be relevant to the same degree. It could possibly be amended, but the goal is to be ready by April 1st because Massachusetts apparently has an RFP out there to go ahead and purchase renewable energy contracts. And the concern is if we don't combine with them, they'll go out, they'll take the low-hanging fruit at the lowest prices, and we'll be left with the dregs.
I should point out that we're actually taping this on March 25th. So by the time this actually is aired, we'll know. We'll know, but we don't know yet. It's kind of like a Daily Show thing. The budget is also going to be a huge issue this year. 2 years ago, your first year in the legislature, the governor and the legislature were looking at, I think, a $3.3 billion shortfall. Give or take, the largest one per capita in the country. Mm-hmm. It was overcome, that deficit was overcome by a very large tax increase as well as givebacks on the part of the state employees' unions and various other ways of saving money.
In exchange for 4 years of no layoffs.
In exchange for 4 years of no layoffs. And so, unfortunately, the economy has not yet picked up and tax receipts are running well below what they had hoped. And so I believe there's another $1 billion we're looking at. Is that the right number?
Well, it's about $1 billion plus a year, so it's closer to $2 billion.
So it'll be
altogether.
two over the next 2 years.
The biannual budget.
Right.
You know, I have great sympathy for the governor. He tried to be bold 2 years ago. He deserved a better hand than he was dealt. The economy is still in the doldrums. Revenues are nowhere near where we were hoping and projected to be. You take that and all the storms that he's had, and he's had one rough start to his time. Unfortunately, even though he campaigned against the kinds of gimmicks and shenanigans that have been part and parcel of budget balancing in the past, both in terms of Republican governors and Democratic legislatures, many of us feel he's kind of resorted to the same old techniques. And he's also up against the spending cap, and we're not exactly clear if he's actually under it with the budget he's proposed. The good news, bad news is it's really not the governor's budget. Eventually it's our budget as the state of Connecticut. And it's now in the legislature's hands, and we have to make it our own. And for every dollar we would choose to restore or every gimmick we want to get rid of, we've got to find someplace else to get it from. And because, as you mentioned, you know, we've already raised taxes higher than we ever have in any session. We've already gone back to the state workers to ask for concessions. We can't go there again in either case. All that's really left are further cuts to the budget, which one would argue is responsible, but we know that there are real people involved, both in terms of the programs and services the state provides and the people who provide them who may be out of jobs depending upon how we go forward. So it's a real conundrum, and the irony is you don't hear as much talk about the budget right now as you might expect, given how urgent it is. Because of gun control, most of leadership has been focused on negotiating gun reform legislation rather than focusing on the budget to the degree we all expected. Most of the action needs to take place in the Appropriations Committee, where most spending decisions are made, but I don't have as much of a sense that leadership has been as focused on it as it typically would at this point in the session.
Do you have any idea in general who the winners and losers are going to be in this? Because as you say, there's going to be a lot of losers.
I think the best we might hope for is that we make everybody a little uncomfortable. It's not typically the way it works. You know, I've always abhorred the idea, as we see with the sequestration on a federal level, of just cutting everybody by the same percentage, because it has very different outcomes depending upon a program, a service, an agency. And in some cases, it really eviscerates their effectiveness. We want to avoid that here, yet we do want to spread it around. For example, the hospitals in the state of Connecticut feel like they're really getting whacked with this budget. They're very much concerned. There are concerns that a few hospitals will actually close because of this. If we were to try to rebalance and not hit them as hard, you might have to find $10, $20, $30 million somewhere else. And we still have difficulty identifying how, in some cases, the cuts that we're recommending for certain areas would actually be carried out without hurting people.
I don't think there's any way you can cut without hurting people at the end of the day.
Right, it's the nature by which we do it. We found that in many cases it's the third-party not-for-profits that provide the most cost-effective quality services. We don't really want to bring them to the point where they're cutting staff and are serving fewer and fewer people. In many cases they do a better job than the state workers, but as we've mentioned, we really can't go after the state workers. They're pretty much protected from layoffs in the near term. So what we might want to do, which is allow those who provide the service more cost effectively to carry on, we may be left with very few choices except to really put them up against it.
I should point out that the deal that Malloy struck with unions that extended a moratorium on layoffs was one that had been done before by Jody Rell in the same situation for the same reason. And she had extended the no layoff period to cover the time that she was governor, and so left Malloy with a situation where he was faced with increases in pay that had been promised by Rell and the legislature before, and unable to meet those promises. So there are no easy answers to this.
We have ourselves in a real bind, and we're all hoping that the economy will pick up and lift all boats, but there really are no indications in the short term that's really happening. There's been some improvement in the unemployment rate. We have added some jobs, but just not quickly enough to have the kind of impact we need in the short term.
Right. One of the areas that you've been active in is around genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and I know that there's a bill in the legislature now that is trying to require that foods that contain GMOs are simply labeled so that consumers would be able to see what it is that they're buying. What's happening with that bill?
The bill is intended to provide consumers with information and choice. We want a very simple system which indicates, is it GMO free? Does it definitely have GMOs? Maybe an in-between ground where it might contain GMOs, so people can make their own choices. It has been problematic. Other states have tried this and have failed. Our bill actually suggests it would not become operative until at least one other state also passes this. It's really a reflection of frustration with the federal government. The Food and Drug Administration, for whatever reason, has determined that these products, the seeds and the products that are generated from it, are safe. Yet they've done very little research to prove that to be the case. And because they've chosen not to do the research, they actually have made it impossible to prove that there is a problem with it. There are those of us who believe the number of Monsanto alumni in FDA right now may have played a role in that, because Monsanto, as many people are aware, is a very aggressive global corporation that is intent upon maximizing its profits by injecting genetically modified organisms everywhere it can. Our bill is a reaction to the fact the federal government has done nothing, and our objective is twofold. One is to actually give an advantage to those produce, milk, whatever, that don't contain GMOs, and let people know that this is something that they may want to be concerned about. Europe has already done this.
Right.
They're way ahead of us. Once again, Americans can be a little bit behind the curve on these kind of things. I hate to think that we are really anti-science to the point that every time we encounter something that's unfortunate, we just stick our heads in the sands and don't want to know about it. That seems to be the case with climate change and a number of other things. And this is potentially a very acute problem for our food sources in America, and we're maybe beyond the tipping point, honestly, where so many of our grains in particular are now genetically modified. You can't even find original unmodified seeds and grains in many cases.
We've done a couple of shows on GMO, and I was stunned to find out that one approach was to have a plant that actually produced its own insecticide from inside the plant in order to kill bugs. I'm thinking, well, if it's got an insecticide that it's producing, it means that that's carrying all the way through the food chain. So I'm going to be eating something that was, a plant that was producing insecticide.
But they're already discovering that as with anything else, when we try to create something that that protects you against something, that the organisms themselves evolve,
of course,
and then become resistant, and then where are you on that?
Right.
And there are plenty of studies out there, despite FDA's and Monsanto's efforts, that show that there are potential carcinogenic, endocrine, even genetic changes that relate to GMOs. So we should all be concerned.
Yes, we definitely should all be concerned. And you spoke recently at a rally, I think, in Hartford around GMOs.
The problem we face today is perhaps the most significant public health issue we have of our generation. And the big problem is that most people don't know about it. It's a stealth issue. If we're going to be successful as a legislature, we need to expand the circle beyond these wonderful, passionate people here and make every citizen of the state of Connecticut not only aware, but care about what's in their foods. Representative Miller didn't want to bash anybody today, but I'll do a little bashing. If we're going to be successful, we are up against some very well-entrenched interests that have much to lose if this goes forward. Do not underestimate the magnitude of the challenge yet before us. Other states have tried and failed. If we're going to be successful in Connecticut, and Connecticut is prepared to be first in something this important, we will need to have everybody's help. Yeah, I've spoken at a couple rallies, and I did testify in favor of the bill when it came before the Public Health Committee.
And you followed whom in that?
Yes, I followed Jerry of Ben & Jerry's, which was not ideal timing. You never want to follow women, children, pets, or Ben & Jerry.
Transportation is always a huge issue here in Fairfield County. You're on the Transportation Committee. I sit on the Commuter Rail Council.
For now.
For now, yes, as long as it's around in its current form. And we've made a huge investment in the new rail cars. And one of the first things that Governor Malloy did when he came in was to extend that investment to pick up even more rail cars at the rate that had been negotiated under the Rell administration. So there is a clear bipartisan consensus around rail transportation and improving that. And now there's on the books a new rail line that's been proposed from New Haven through Hartford to Springfield and turn that into a commuter rail. What's happening with that?
They made some progress. As you may be aware, there was an old rail line up there, so they have the basis to move forward. One of the key components of that is something called transit-oriented development. The idea is every place you have a station, you try to have the right kind of development around it, residential, appropriate commercial to support that, such that it's more efficient and people can live more efficiently. They don't have to have cars or use their cars to the same degree. It's supposed to be a model for Connecticut on how we can foster development that's both good for transportation and for people.
Right.
That's the goal. We'll see how that plays out in some ways. There are some concerns, though, that because all of the state's focus seems to be going against that particular line, or the New Britain to Hartford busway, that we're not paying as much attention to the pressing infrastructure needs elsewhere in the state, both in terms of rail and highways and bridges. And that's a big concern to me. Some estimates suggest we need $5 or $6 billion over the next 30 years just to manage our existing infrastructure.
Right.
And we're not getting that investment right now. Representative Lavielle and I introduced legislation to make sure that the increases in rail fees that were related to the introduction of those new rail cars were used exclusively and explicitly for infrastructure reinvestment.
What happened to that bill?
It didn't make it very far, but there are two things that did come out of transportation and we're very proud of. It led to a resolution, which is a little toothless, by the Transportation Committee that we should pursue a constitutional amendment which would assure that monies put into the transportation fund could not be rated by the legislature and the governor going forward, which we've done on a regular basis.
Right. You were mentioning earlier gimmicks in part of the governor's budget, and that's definitely one of them. We're taking $75 million out of the transportation fund and putting it back into the general fund.
So that's our objective.
Right.
The constitutional path is a little different. It takes a couple of years for it to even happen, but it's worth doing. Another thing we could talk about are the possibility of bringing in congestion pricing tolls into Connecticut. And there's a feeling that if we're going to even contemplate collecting any user fees for use of the roads, that again, those funds be rededicated to the infrastructure improvements that we're going to definitely need.
I've read that we could be raising as much as $1 billion a year if we put tolls on the interstates. And there are various ways to do those tolls, one of which is called gateway tolls, which would be toll stations only at the borders. So people who were crossing from New York into Connecticut, or crossing from Rhode Island into Connecticut, or from Massachusetts into Connecticut, wherever they came across the border on one of the interstates, would be paying a toll at that point. But when people think of tolls, they think again of toll booths and the horrible accident back in 1987.
Every time we bring it up, we get the same newspaper photos of the crash and fire at Stratford, and that is just so old paradigm.
Right.
Even the idea of setting up tolls at the borders is kind of antiquated. It was an original language of the bill that was in transportation. It was taken out because today's tolls are a simple sort of metal gantry that's over the roadway, which may have infrared readers, potentially cameras for those who don't have an easy pass kind of transponder, and they can be set up at any point. You don't even necessarily know which ones are working at any point in time. They're really able to track your progress without being at the borders, which means that there's less of an incentive for trucks or drivers to get off the road onto the local roads because they don't know really where they're going to be monitored in that sense. And it also allows you, because of technology, to do some pretty cool things. You can change the price depending upon time of day. If it's rush hour, maybe you want to raise the price to get some of those big trucks off the roads, or cars, people who don't need to be there at that hour. Maybe it's free at 2 in the morning. Maybe you discount it for people who are lower income, or for those who run small businesses in Connecticut who are only really traveling within the state. There are really a lot of opportunities. We had a wonderful presentation before the Transportation Committee about a month ago, which shows that we've really come a long ways, and we're really kind of the exception in the Northeast Corridor. Connecticut is one of a few states, I think Rhode Island is the other local exception, where we don't have tolls. We could be installing state-of-the-art tolls that really benefit Connecticut and make sure those who use the roads pay for their fair share.
I was in New Hampshire this past weekend and went through Massachusetts to get there and paid tolls coming and going, and just it's part of life. When you're traveling on I-95 or 93 or 91.
Yet most of my colleagues in the area are dead set against it. It's unpopular. As with many things, we have to re-educate the consumer that this can be something that is not a punitive additional tax as much as a way to make sure that we generate enough funds to keep our roads in good shape.
I think the strongest argument is that we would begin to collect significant revenues from those trucks that supply New England, the rest of New England, with 95% of the freight. There are no railroads practically going into New England any longer. And so everything goes by truck, and we are the gateway. And they use our roads, they should pay for it.
And if that levels the playing field and encourages greater use of Connecticut's ports to transport cargo, or maybe bringing in a little light freight, maybe that's a good answer too.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, there's a lot going on in the legislature, and I know you're up there almost every day, right in the heart of it. So keep up the good work, and come back and let us know what happens when it's all over.
Anytime, John. We're all in this together.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. You can catch all our shows on YouTube by going to youtube.com/user/DFATVnet. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and you can send comments or suggestions for a show to info@dfa-tv.net. If you'd like to learn more about progressive political action, we meet on the first Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk. We'd love to have you join us. Remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Thanks for watching.